Baby found, mother bear, having difficult birth. Outside hospital, what happened next was shocking. The morning mist clung to Mountain View Hospital like a gentle blanket, wrapping the building in an ethereal silence that made everything feel suspended between dreams and reality. Jessica Brooks pulled her cardigan tighter as she stepped out of her car in the employee parking lot, the October air carrying whispers of the approaching winter. She had been working the night shift in the pediatric ward for 3 years now, but something about this particular morning felt different. The mountains that surrounded their small Colorado town seemed closer somehow, as if they were leaning in to listen to secrets only the dawn could tell. 2-year-old Lily Morgan sat in her car seat, her wide brown eyes taking in the world with a wonder that only belongs to children who still believe in magic. Her mother had brought her to work early today because the babysitter had called in sick, and Jessica's supervisor had agreed to let the toddler stay in the break room until the day shift arrived. Lily's tiny hands pressed against the car window, her breath creating small clouds of fog that she traced with her finger, drawing invisible pictures that seemed to dance in the morning light. "Come on, sweetheart," Jessica whispered, unbuckling the car seat with practiced ease. "We need to get inside before the morning rounds begin." But as she lifted Lily into her arms, something made her pause. There was a sound drifting through the trees that bordered the hospital grounds, something that didn't quite belong to the usual symphony of morning birds and rustling leaves. It was low and mournful, almost like crying, but deeper and more primal than any human voice could produce. Lily's head turned sharply toward the sound, her little body becoming alert in a way that surprised Jessica. The toddler had always been sensitive to sounds and emotions, often crying when others were upset or laughing before anyone else noticed something funny. But this was different. This was focused, as if she was hearing something that called specifically to her. "Mama," Lily whispered, pointing toward the dense line of pine trees that separated the hospital from the wilderness beyond. Sad. Jessica followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual in the shadows between the trees. The sound came again, clearer this time, and she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. It was definitely an animal in distress. Something large by the sound of it, but what kind of creature would venture so close to a busy hospital? The parking lot was already filling with the cars of the day shift workers, and the emergency department never truly slept. Whatever was making that sound should have been frightened away by now. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open with their familiar whoosh, and the warm air from inside carried the familiar sense of antiseptic and coffee that had become as comforting to Jessica as her own home. She nodded to the security guard at the front desk and made her way toward the elevators, Lily still clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit and staring back toward the windows that faced the woods. The crying sound had stopped, but something in her daughter's expression told Jessica that the little girl was still listening for it. The pediatric ward was quieter than usual for a morning shift change, with most of the young patients still sleeping peacefully in their rooms. Jessica settled Lily in the break room with some coloring books and crackers, promising she would be back soon to check on her. The toddler nodded solemnly, but her attention kept drifting to the window that offered a view of the trees behind the hospital. She climbed onto a chair and pressed her nose to the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she searched for something only she seemed to understand. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric resident who had become Jessica's closest friend over the past year, poked her head into the break room with a tired smile. "How's our little visitor this morning?" she asked, ruffling Lily's dark curls affectionately. The toddler looked up at her with those serious brown eyes that always seemed to hold more wisdom than her age should allow. "She's been acting strange since we got here," Jessica admitted, lowering her voice so Lily wouldn't overhear. "There was some kind of animal crying in the woods when we arrived, and she seemed to know exactly where it was coming from. You know how she gets sometimes, like she can sense things the rest of us miss. Dr. Chen nodded knowingly. She had witnessed Lily's unusual sensitivity on several occasions, like the time the toddler had started crying inconsolably just minutes before they received news that one of their long-term patients had taken a turn for the worse. As the morning progressed, Jessica tried to focus on her rounds and the medication schedules that needed to be updated, but she found herself glancing toward the break room window whenever she passed by. Lily had remained at her post by the glass, occasionally pressing her small hands against the surface and whispering words that Jessica couldn't quite make out. The other nurses had begun to notice the little girl's behavior too, stopping by to offer snacks or toys, but nothing could distract her from whatever she was watching for in the trees. Around 10 o'clock, as the morning sun began to burn through the mist and reveal the full beauty of the autumn landscape, Lily suddenly became very still. Her entire body went rigid with attention, and she pressed both palms flat against the window as if she could somehow reach through the glass. "Mama," she called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made Jessica drop the chart she was updating and rush to the break room. "What is it, baby?" Jessica asked, kneeling beside her daughter's chair and following her gaze toward the trees. At first, she saw nothing but the usual mix of pine and aspen trees, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. But then, in the shadows near the emergency department's back entrance, something moved. Something large and dark that definitely didn't belong in a hospital parking area. The shape emerged from between the trees slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether this strange human territory was safe. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. A black bear, massive and clearly female, was making her way across the small clearing behind the hospital. But this wasn't the confident, purposeful movement of a healthy, wild animal. The bear was moving awkwardly, stopping frequently to rest against trees or rocks, her breathing visible in the cool air as heavy puffs of vapor. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, reaching for her phone to call security. But before she could dial, Lily was climbing down from her chair with a determination that Jessica had never seen in her daughter before. The toddler walked to the break room door and stood there, her tiny hand on the handle, looking back at her mother with eyes that seemed to hold an ancient understanding. "Lily, no," Jessica said firmly, moving to block her daughter's path. "That's a dangerous animal, sweetheart. We need to stay inside and let the grown-ups handle this." But Lily shook her head with the stubborn certainty that only a 2-year-old could muster. She pointed toward the bear and said one word that made Jessica's heart skip a beat. "Help." The sound came again then, that low, mournful crying that had drawn their attention earlier, and Jessica realized with a shock that it was coming from the bear. The animal had collapsed near a large pine tree about 50 yards from the hospital's back entrance, and even from their window, Jessica could see that she was in distress. The bear's sides were heaving with effort, and she kept shifting position as if she couldn't find comfort anywhere. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion, and her medical training kicked in immediately when she saw the situation. "That bear is in labor," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and concern. "And from the looks of it, she's having complications. We need to call Animal Control and the State Wildlife Department immediately." But as the adults discussed protocols and safety measures, Lily had somehow managed to slip past them and was now standing at the break room's exterior door, which led to a small patio area used by staff during breaks. The door had an electronic lock that should have been impossible for a toddler to open, but somehow it was now standing ajar, and Lily was already stepping outside into the crisp morning air. "Lily!" Jessica called out in panic, rushing after her daughter. But the little girl moved with surprising speed and purpose, crossing the patio and heading directly toward the struggling bear. Jessica's nurse training warred with her maternal instincts as she watched her 2-year-old daughter approach one of the most dangerous animals in North America. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should tackle Lily and carry her back to safety, but something deeper, some instinct she didn't fully understand, held her back. The bear's head lifted as Lily approached, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two creatures looked at each other across the space that separated wild from civilized, animal from human, ancient from new. The bear's dark eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, seemed to focus on the tiny figure walking toward her with fearless determination. Instead of the aggressive posture Jessica expected, the bear's ears came forward in what looked almost like curiosity. Lily stopped about 10 feet from the bear and sat down cross-legged on the damp grass, her stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. She began to hum, a soft, wordless melody that Jessica recognized as the lullaby her own grandmother had sung to her as a child. The tune seemed to drift through the morning air like a bridge between two worlds, and incredibly, the bear's breathing began to slow and deepen. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the windows of the hospital. Security guards, doctors, nurses, and even some patients who were able to walk had come to witness this impossible scene. Dr. Ethan Marshall, the veterinarian who consulted at the hospital for their therapy animal program, had been called in and was now standing beside Jessica, his professional assessment warring with his amazement at what he was witnessing. "This shouldn't be happening," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "Wild bears, especially females in labor, are incredibly dangerous and unpredictable. She should have either fled or attacked by now. But look at her." The bear had indeed settled into a more comfortable position, her massive head resting on her front paws as she listened to Lily's gentle humming. Her breathing had become more regular, and some of the tension had left her powerful shoulders. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the impromptu birthing ground, Lily continued her vigil. She had stopped humming, but remained perfectly still, her presence somehow providing comfort to the laboring bear. The adults watched in fascination and growing concern as the bear's contractions became more visible and intense. This was clearly going to be a long and difficult birth, and the question of what to do became increasingly urgent. Animal control officers had arrived and were setting up a perimeter, but their usual protocols seemed inadequate for this unprecedented situation. The bear showed no signs of aggression, but she also showed no inclination to leave. More concerning was the fact that any attempt to approach or remove Lily seemed to agitate the bear, while the toddler's presence clearly had a calming effect. Dr. Marshall found himself in the unusual position of providing veterinary consultation for a wild animal birth in a hospital parking area, with a 2-year-old serving as an unofficial midwife. He had delivered countless animals during his career, but nothing had prepared him for the profound sense of witnessing something sacred that seemed to permeate the entire scene. As the hours passed, Lily never moved from her spot on the grass. Jessica brought her daughter a jacket and some water, approaching slowly and speaking in soothing tones that seemed to reassure both the bear and the growing crowd of observers. The bear acknowledged Jessica's presence with what could only be described as a nod of approval, as if recognizing that this human was connected to the small guardian who had chosen to stay with her during her time of need. The first cub began to emerge just as the sun reached its zenith, and the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd was audible even through the closed windows. The bear's efforts intensified, and Lily began to hum again, her childish voice providing a soundtrack to one of nature's most fundamental miracles. The cub slipped into the world wet and helpless, and the mother bear immediately began the ancient ritual of cleaning and stimulating her newborn. But something was wrong. Dr. Marshall could see it in the bear's posture and the way she kept looking toward her belly. There was at least one more cub, and the birth was not progressing as it should. The mother bear was growing weaker, and her breathing was becoming labored in a way that had nothing to do with normal birthing efforts. Lily seemed to sense the change in the situation immediately. She stood up for the first time in hours, her little legs unsteady from sitting so long, and walked closer to the bear. The massive animal lifted her head and looked directly into the toddler's eyes, and something passed between them that transcended species and language. Lily reached out her tiny hand and gently placed it on the bear's massive head, and the bear closed her eyes as if drawing strength from that innocent touch. What happened next would be talked about in the small mountain town for generations to come. Lily began to breathe in a slow, deliberate rhythm, and incredibly, the bear began to match that rhythm. The toddler's chest rose and fell in perfect synchronization with the laboring mother, as if she was somehow sharing her own life force with the struggling animal. The crowd of observers fell completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that belonged more to the realm of legend than to the everyday world of medical science. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink when the second cub finally made its appearance. This birth was easier, as if the mother bear had found new strength from some mysterious source. The tiny cub slid into the world with a soft thud, and immediately began the squeaking cries that announced its arrival to the world. As the bear tended to her second newborn, Lily finally stepped back from her vigil. She looked exhausted but peaceful, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had completed an important task. She walked back to where Jessica was waiting with open arms, and as mother and daughter embraced, the bear lifted her head and looked directly at them. The expression in those dark, intelligent eyes was unmistakably one of gratitude. The bear seemed to nod once, a gesture so human-like that several observers later swore they had imagined it. Then she gathered her cubs close to her warm body and settled in for what everyone assumed would be a well-deserved rest. But the day's miracles were not yet complete. As the hospital staff began to discuss the logistics of the situation and what should happen next, something extraordinary caught everyone's attention. The second cub, the one whose birth had been so difficult, had a distinctive marking on its tiny shoulder. It was a birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon, dark against the cub's lighter fur. Dr. Chen was the first to notice it, and her gasp drew everyone's attention to what she had seen. "Jessica," she whispered, her voice filled with amazement. "Look at Lily's shoulder." Jessica gently moved her daughter's jacket aside, revealing what she had seen countless times during bath time but had never really thought about. There, on Lily's left shoulder, was a birthmark identical to the one on the cub. The same crescent moon shape, the same size, in exactly the same position. The implications of this discovery rippled through the crowd like electricity. Coincidences of this magnitude simply didn't happen in the rational world of modern medicine. Yet here was evidence that suggested some connection between the human child and the bear cub that defied all logical explanation. Dr. Marshall found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. As darkness began to fall over Mountain View Hospital, the bear showed no signs of wanting to leave her chosen birthing spot. The cubs were nursing successfully, and the mother seemed to have recovered her strength, but she appeared content to remain where she was. The hospital administration found themselves in the unprecedented position of having a family of wild bears as temporary residents on their grounds. Emergency protocols were established for the night shift. The area around the bear family was cordoned off with a respectful distance maintained, but security cameras were positioned to monitor the situation. Lily had finally been convinced to go inside for dinner and a nap, but she insisted on sleeping in the break room where she could see the window that looked out toward her new friends. As Jessica tucked her daughter into a makeshift bed of blankets on the break room couch, Lily looked up at her with those wise eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. "Mama," she whispered, "the sad is gone now." Jessica kissed her daughter's forehead and wondered what other mysteries this small person might reveal as she grew older. The night passed peacefully, with the Bear family resting comfortably under the watchful eyes of the hospital staff. But as dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of another day filled with questions and wonder, no one could have predicted what revelations the morning light would bring. The story that had begun with a crying in the woods was far from over, and the connection between a 2-year-old girl and a family of bears was about to reveal depths that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the invisible threads that connect all living things. The first light of dawn painted the hospital grounds in soft pastels of rose and gold, and Lily was already awake, her small face pressed against the break room window as she watched the Bear family stirring in their makeshift den beneath the pine tree. The mother bear had positioned herself so that she could keep watch over both her cubs and the hospital building, as if she too understood that this strange arrangement required vigilance from all parties involved. Jessica had barely slept, alternating between checking on her daughter and monitoring the reports from the security team throughout the night. The Bear family had remained peaceful, with the mother occasionally rising to stretch or adjust her position, but never venturing far from the spot where she had given birth. The cubs had nursed regularly and seemed to be thriving, their tiny squeaks and movements visible even from the hospital windows. Dr. Ethan Marshall arrived before his usual time, carrying a large coffee and a bag of pastries that he hoped might serve as peace offerings to the hospital staff who had been dealing with this unprecedented situation. He had spent most of the previous evening on the phone with wildlife experts, veterinary colleagues, and state officials, trying to find some precedent for what they were witnessing. The consensus was unanimous. Nothing like this had ever been documented before. "How are our patients this morning?" he asked Jessica as he joined her at the break room window. Lily looked up at him with a smile that seemed to contain more knowledge than any 2-year-old should possess, then returned her attention to the bears outside. The veterinarian had to admit that there was something almost mystical about the child's connection to the animals, something that his scientific training couldn't quite explain or dismiss. The morning shift change brought a new crowd of curious observers, but the hospital administration had established strict protocols to prevent the situation from becoming a circus. Only essential personnel were allowed near the windows that faced the bears, and absolutely no one was permitted outside without explicit authorization from both the hospital security team and the state wildlife officers, who had taken up residence in the parking lot. As the sun climbed higher, something remarkable began to happen. Other animals started appearing at the edges of the clearing where the Bear family had made their temporary home. First came a family of deer, stepping delicately from the forest to graze peacefully within sight of the bears. Then rabbits emerged from the underbrush, followed by squirrels and chipmunks who seemed completely unafraid of the large predator in their midst. Dr. Marshall watched this gathering with growing amazement. In all his years of veterinary practice and wildlife observation, he had never seen anything like it. Prey animals simply didn't behave this way around bears, especially not a mother with cubs. Yet here was a virtual Noah's Ark of forest creatures, all seeming to understand that this was a place of peace and safety. "It's like they're celebrating," whispered Doctor Chen, who had arrived early to witness what everyone was calling the miracle at Mountain View Hospital. "Look at how calm they all are. It's as if Lily's presence has created some kind of sanctuary where the usual rules of nature don't apply." Lily had noticed the gathering animals too, and her excitement was palpable. She pressed both hands against the window and began making soft, clicking sounds with her tongue, sounds that seemed to draw the attention of several of the smaller creatures. A particularly bold squirrel actually approached the hospital building, standing on its hind legs as if trying to get a better look at the little girl in the window. The bear mother had been watching this interaction with what could only be described as approval. She made a soft chuffing sound that seemed to encourage the other animals, and gradually the clearing began to resemble a peaceful gathering rather than the tense standoff that wildlife experts had predicted. The cubs, now more alert and mobile than they had been the day before, began to explore the immediate area around their mother. Their playful, tumbling drawing delighted giggles from Lily. Around mid-morning, something happened that would forever change how everyone involved thought about the connection between humans and animals. One of the cubs, the smaller one with the crescent moon birthmark, wandered a little farther from its mother than usual. The cub seemed drawn toward the hospital building, sniffing the air and making small, curious sounds as it explored this strange new world. The mother bear watched her adventurous offspring with the patient attention of mothers everywhere, but she made no move to call the cub back. Instead, she seemed to be encouraging this exploration, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like encouragement. The cub continued its investigation until it was directly below the break room window where Lily was watching. What happened next defied every piece of conventional wisdom about wild animal behavior. The cub looked up at the window, seeming to focus directly on Lily's face, and began to make a series of soft, musical sounds. These weren't the typical grunts or squeaks of a bear cub, but something that sounded almost like singing. The sounds were hauntingly beautiful, with a melody that seemed to echo the lullaby Lily had hummed the day before. Lily's response was immediate and instinctive. She began to hum along with the cub's song, her childish voice blending with the animal's vocalizations in a harmony that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. The duet continued for several minutes, with mother and cub, human and bear, creating music together across the barrier of glass and species. Dr. Marshall found himself recording the interaction on his phone, knowing that without evidence, no one would believe what they were witnessing. The harmony between the child and the cub was so perfect, so natural, that it seemed as if they had been practicing together for years rather than meeting for the first time just 24 hours earlier. As the song faded, the cub placed its tiny paws against the base of the hospital building, directly below where Lily's hands were pressed against the window. For a moment, it looked as if they were touching across the impossible divide of glass and species, and everyone watching felt they were witnessing something sacred. The mother bear had been observing this interaction with intense interest, and now she made a decision that surprised everyone. She rose to her feet and walked slowly toward the hospital building, her movements deliberate and purposeful. The crowd of observers held their breath, unsure whether this represented a threat or something else entirely. But the bear's intentions became clear as she approached the window where Lily was watching. She sat back on her haunches, bringing her massive head to roughly the same level as the little girl, and simply looked. The two beings, separated by glass and evolution, studied each other with an intensity that spoke of recognition rather than curiosity. Jessica felt her heart pounding as she watched her daughter interact with one of nature's most powerful predators. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to pull Lily away from the window, but something deeper held her back. There was no aggression in the bear's posture, no threat in her dark eyes. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like gratitude and understanding. The bear raised one massive paw and gently touched the glass, directly opposite where Lily's small hand was pressed. The gesture was so human-like, so clearly intentional, that several observers gasped audibly. It was as if the bear was trying to bridge the gap between their worlds, to make contact across the barriers that separated them. Lily responded by spreading all 5 fingers against the glass, matching the bear's paw print as closely as her tiny hand would allow. They stayed like that for several long moments, human child and wild mother, connected by something that transcended the physical barriers between them. The silence in the break room was profound, broken only by the soft breathing of the people who had gathered to witness this unprecedented interaction. Dr. Marshall later said that he felt as if he was watching the birth of a new kind of communication, something that existed beyond language or species. The connection between Lily and the bear was so obvious, so powerful, that it challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. As the day progressed, the pattern of interaction continued. The cubs would venture closer to the hospital building, always under their mother's watchful eye, and Lily would respond with songs, gestures, or simply her presence at the window. The other animals that had gathered seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly being drawn to the peaceful energy that surrounded the bear family. Hospital staff found excuses to pass by the break room throughout the day, each wanting to witness the miracle for themselves. Word had begun to spread throughout the small mountain town, and the hospital administration found themselves fielding calls from reporters, wildlife enthusiasts, and curious citizens who had heard rumors of the impossible friendship developing on their grounds. But perhaps the most significant development came in the afternoon, when Dr. Marshall made a discovery that would add another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable situation. While researching the hospital's history in preparation for the inevitable media attention, he had stumbled across something in the archived records that made his blood run cold. The hospital had been built on land that had once belonged to a family named Morgan, the same last name as little Lily. The original deed, dating back to the early 1900s, included a curious clause about protecting the wildlife that lived on the property. More intriguingly, there were several documented accounts of the Morgan family having unusual relationships with the local bear population. One account, written by the town's first doctor in 1923, described how Martha Morgan had assisted in the birth of bear cubs during a particularly harsh winter, somehow managing to approach and help wild bears that should have been completely unapproachable. The doctor had dismissed the account as folklore, but now, Dr. Marshall wondered if there might be more truth to the old stories than anyone had realized. The connection became even more intriguing when he discovered that Martha Morgan had been known for a distinctive birthmark on her shoulder, described in her medical records as crescent-shaped, resembling the phases of the moon. The similarities to Lily's birthmark and to that of the bear cub were too significant to be mere coincidence. As evening approached, the bear family showed no signs of wanting to leave their chosen sanctuary. The mother had established a routine of feeding her cubs, resting, and maintaining her vigil over both her offspring and the hospital building, where her small human friend kept watch. The cubs had grown more adventurous throughout the day, exploring farther from their mother, but always returning to the safety of her presence. Lily had maintained her own vigil, taking breaks only for meals and brief naps, always returning to her post at the window. Her connection to the bear family seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, and Jessica began to worry about what would happen when the inevitable separation occurred. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her wild friends must eventually return to the forest where they belong? As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, something magical happened that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The mother bear stood and walked to the center of the clearing, her cubs following close behind. She looked directly at the hospital building, at the window where Lily was watching, and began to make a series of vocalizations that sounded almost like a song. The cubs joined their mother, their smaller voices harmonizing with hers in a chorus that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It was a farewell song, a thank you, a promise, all rolled into one haunting melody that spoke to something deep in the human soul. Lily pressed herself against the window, tears streaming down her small face, and began to hum along with her wild friends. The song continued for several minutes, with hospital staff throughout the building stopping whatever they were doing to listen. Many found themselves crying without understanding why, moved by something that touched a primal part of their being that they had forgotten existed. It was as if the bears were reminding them of a time when humans and animals shared a common language, a common understanding of their place in the natural world. As the song faded and darkness began to fall, the bear family settled in for what everyone hoped would be their final night at the hospital. But the events of the past 2 days had changed everyone who had witnessed them, and the questions they raised about the connections between all living things would continue long after the bears returned to their forest home. Dr. Marshall spent the evening compiling his notes and recordings, knowing that he was documenting something that would be studied and debated for years to come. The bond between Lily and the bear family challenged everything science thought it knew about interspecies communication and connection. Yet the evidence was undeniable, recorded on video and witnessed by dozens of credible observers. As Jessica tucked Lily into her makeshift bed in the break room, the little girl looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. "Mama," she whispered, "they're going home soon, but remember, and I'll remember too." Jessica kissed her daughter's forehead and wondered what other secrets this remarkable child might reveal as she grew older. The night passed peacefully, with the bear family resting under the stars, while their human friends kept watch from the warmth of the hospital. But as dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of answers to questions that had been building for 2 days, no one could have predicted the revelations that the morning light would bring. The impossible bond between a little girl and a family of bears was about to reveal connections that reached back through generations, touching on mysteries that had been hidden in the mountains for over a century. The third morning brought with it a sense of anticipation that seemed to permeate every corner of Mountain View Hospital. The bear family had remained in their chosen sanctuary throughout the night, but there was something different in the air, something that suggested change was coming. Lily had awakened before dawn, as she had for the past 2 days, and had taken her familiar position at the break room window. But this morning her behavior was different. Instead of the excited energy she had shown previously, there was a calmness about her, a sense of patient waiting that seemed far too mature for a 2-year-old. Jessica had spent much of the night researching her own family history, driven by Dr. Marshall's discovery about the Morgan family and their connection to the hospital grounds. What she found in old family documents and faded photographs left her questioning everything she thought she knew about her heritage. Her great-grandmother had indeed been Martha Morgan, the woman mentioned in the old medical records. More disturbing was the discovery of a family journal that had been passed down through the women in her family, a journal that contained entries about dreams, visions, and unexplained connections to the wildlife of the mountains. The journal entries, written in her great-grandmother's careful script, described encounters with bears that defied all logic and reason. Martha Morgan had written about being called to help animals in distress, about understanding their needs without words, about a responsibility that had been passed down through generations of women in their family. The entries spoke of a sacred trust, a bond between the Morgan women and the guardian spirits of the mountain, spirits that sometimes took the form of bears. Dr. Marshall arrived early again, this time accompanied by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in animal behavior who had driven through the night from Denver after hearing about the unprecedented events at Mountain View Hospital. Dr. Rodriguez had spent her career studying interspecies communication and had published several papers on the possibility of genetic memory in both humans and animals. Her presence added a new level of scientific scrutiny to the situation, but also brought hope that there might be explanations for what they were witnessing. As the morning progressed, the bear family's behavior began to change in subtle but significant ways. The mother bear, who had maintained her protective vigil for 3 days, began to move more freely around the clearing. She would venture to the edges of the forest, always keeping her cubs in sight, but clearly testing the boundaries of their temporary home. The cubs themselves had grown noticeably stronger and more coordinated, their playful interactions becoming more sophisticated and purposeful. Lily watched these changes with an understanding that continued to amaze the adults around her. She seemed to know instinctively what the bears were preparing for, and her own behavior began to mirror their restlessness. She would move away from the window for longer periods, playing quietly with her toys, or drawing pictures that invariably featured bears and mountains and little girls with outstretched arms. Around midday, Dr. Rodriguez made an observation that sent ripples of excitement through the gathered medical staff. She had been studying the interaction patterns between Lily and the bear family, paying particular attention to the timing and nature of their communications. What she discovered was a level of synchronization that suggested something far more complex than simple mimicry or learned behavior. The vocalizations that passed between Lily and the cubs followed patterns that were consistent with documented cases of genetic memory in other species. The melodies, the timing, even the emotional content seemed to be following some kind of inherited template, as if both the human child and the bear cubs were accessing information that had been encoded in their DNA by previous generations. Dr. Rodriguez shared her preliminary findings with the doctor. Marshall and Jessica, her voice filled with the excitement of someone who had stumbled upon a discovery that could revolutionize understanding of interspecies communication. The implications were staggering. If genetic memory could account for the connection between Lily and the bears, it suggested that the bond between the Morgan family and the mountain's wildlife was not just folklore, but a biological reality that had been passed down through generations. The afternoon brought visitors that no one had expected. An elderly Native American woman named Sarah Windwalker arrived at the hospital, accompanied by 2 younger men who introduced themselves as her grandsons. Sarah was a member of the local Ute tribe and served as a keeper of the old stories and traditions. She had heard about the events at the hospital and had come to offer her perspective on what was happening. Sarah's presence brought a new dimension to the mystery surrounding Lily and the bear family. She spoke of ancient agreements between her people and the spirits of the mountain, agreements that included the protection of certain bloodlines that served as bridges between the human and animal worlds. The Morgan family, she explained, had been known to her ancestors as the Bear Keepers, people who carried the responsibility of maintaining the balance between civilization and wilderness. According to Sarah's stories, the Bear Keepers were chosen by the mountain spirits themselves, marked with the crescent moon symbol that appeared on both human and bear children, who were destined to serve as guardians of the ancient covenant. The birthmarks were not coincidences, but signs of a spiritual connection that transcended the boundaries between species. As Sarah spoke, Lily had left her post at the window and approached the elderly woman with the fearless curiosity that had characterized her interactions with the bears. Sarah looked into the child's eyes and nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had found confirmation of something she had long suspected. She spoke to Lily in a mixture of English and Ute, her words carrying the weight of generations of wisdom. Lily listened with an attention that seemed impossible for someone her age, occasionally nodding as if she understood concepts that should have been far beyond her comprehension. When Sarah finished speaking, the little girl walked to her mother and took her hand, leading Jessica to the window where the bear family could be seen preparing for what everyone now understood would be their departure. The mother bear had gathered her cubs close to her, and all three animals were looking directly at the hospital building. There was something ceremonial about their posture, something that suggested they were preparing for a formal farewell, rather than simply wandering back into the forest. The other animals that had gathered over the past 3 days had begun to disperse, as if they too understood that the special time was coming to an end. Sarah Windwalker joined the family at the window, her weathered face showing deep emotion as she watched the bear family's preparations. She began to speak in her native language, her words carrying the rhythm and cadence of a prayer or blessing. Dr. Marshall found himself recording this moment too, sensing that he was witnessing the conclusion of something that had begun long before any of them were born. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the mother bear stood and walked to the exact spot where she had given birth 3 days earlier. Her cubs followed, taking positions on either side of their mother as she faced the hospital building. The 3 bears then began a vocalization that was unlike anything they had produced before. It was complex, layered, almost musical in its structure, and it seemed to be directed specifically at the little girl watching from the window. Lily's response was immediate and instinctive. She pressed both hands against the glass and began to sing, her childish voice weaving through the bear's song with a harmony that seemed impossible, and yet perfectly natural. The duet continued for several minutes with human and animal voices, creating something that transcended the boundaries between species and touched something primal and sacred in everyone who heard it. As the song reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The smaller cub, the one with the crescent moon birthmark, approached the hospital building and stood directly below Lily's window. The cub then did something that defied every principle of wild animal behavior. It raised up on its hind legs and placed its front paws against the building, as if trying to reach through the glass to touch the little girl above. Lily immediately knelt and placed her hands against the window, directly opposite the cub's paws. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 young beings connected across the impossible divide of glass and species, their matching birthmarks seeming to glow in the fading light of day. The image was so powerful, so symbolic of the bridge between worlds that they represented, that several observers found themselves weeping without understanding why. The connection lasted only a few seconds, but its impact was profound and lasting. When the cub finally dropped back to all fours and returned to its mother's side, everyone watching understood that they had witnessed something that belonged more to the realm of legend than to the everyday world of modern medicine. The bond between Lily and the bear cub had transcended the physical barriers between them, creating a moment of pure communication that spoke to the deepest parts of the human soul. As darkness began to fall over the mountain valley, the bear family made their final preparations for departure. The mother bear led her cubs to the edge of the clearing, where the forest shadows offered the promise of home and safety. But before disappearing into the wilderness, she turned back one final time to look at the hospital building where her human friends were watching. The bear's final gesture was one that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. She stood tall on her hind legs, her massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky, and raised one paw in what could only be described as a wave of farewell. It was a gesture so human, so clearly intentional, that it left no doubt about the intelligence and emotional depth of the creature they had come to know over the past 3 days. Lily responded by pressing her entire body against the window, her small hands waving frantically as tears streamed down her face. She understood, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to very young children, that this goodbye was necessary but not permanent. The connection she had formed with the Bear family would endure, woven into the fabric of her being, and carried forward into whatever future awaited her. The Bear family disappeared into the forest as quietly as they had emerged from it, leaving behind only memories and the profound sense that everyone involved had been changed by the experience. The clearing that had served as their temporary home looked empty now, but there was something in the air that suggested their presence would be felt for years to come. Dr. Marshall spent the evening compiling his final reports and organizing the documentation that would preserve this extraordinary event for future study. The video recordings, photographs, and witness testimonies would provide researchers with material to analyze for decades, but he knew that the true significance of what had happened would never be fully captured in scientific journals or academic papers. Jessica found herself holding Lily a little tighter that night, understanding in a new way the precious and mysterious nature of the child she had been blessed to raise. The discovery of her family's history had opened doors to questions she had never thought to ask, but it had also provided answers to mysteries she had always sensed but never understood. As the hospital settled into its normal nighttime routine, with the usual sounds of medical equipment and quiet conversations replacing the extraordinary silence that had marked the past 3 days, everyone involved began the process of integrating what they had experienced into their understanding of the world. The story of Lily and the Bear family would be told and retold in the years that followed, growing in the telling, but never losing its essential truth. It became part of the folklore of the mountain town, a reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that science cannot fully explain, connections that transcend the boundaries we think separate us from the natural world. Years passed, and Lily grew from a toddler into a young girl with an extraordinary gift for understanding and communicating with animals. Her childhood was marked by encounters with wildlife that seemed to seek her out, drawn by something they recognized in her presence. She became known throughout the region as someone who could calm frightened animals, heal wounded creatures, and bridge the gap between the human and natural worlds. Jessica watched her daughter's development with a mixture of pride and wonder, understanding now that Lily's gifts were part of a legacy that stretched back through generations of Morgan women. The family journal that had revealed so much about their history became a guide for understanding Lily's abilities and helping her develop them in positive ways. Dr. Marshall continued his work at the hospital, but his experience with the Bear family had fundamentally changed his approach to veterinary medicine. He began incorporating alternative healing methods into his practice, paying attention to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of animal health in ways that his traditional training had never addressed. The hospital itself became something of a pilgrimage site for people who had heard the story of the miracle at Mountain View, while the administration tried to maintain a professional atmosphere. There was an understanding among the staff that they had been part of something extraordinary, something that had touched their lives in ways that would endure long after the memories of routine medical procedures had faded. Sarah Windwalker became a regular visitor to the hospital, serving as an unofficial advisor on matters related to the spiritual dimensions of healing. Her presence brought comfort to patients and staff alike, and her stories about the old ways helped bridge the gap between traditional medicine and the ancient wisdom that had guided her people for centuries. The Bear family was occasionally spotted in the forests surrounding the hospital, always at a respectful distance, but clearly maintaining some connection to the place where their cubs had been born. Wildlife photographers and researchers made pilgrimages to the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous bears, but the family seemed to appear only when they chose to, following patterns that human observers could never predict or control. On the anniversary of the cub's birth, Lily would often be found at the break room window, looking out toward the forest with the patient attention that had characterized her vigil during those 3 extraordinary days. Hospital staff learned to give her space during these times, understanding that she was maintaining a connection that transcended their ability to understand or explain. As Lily approached her 5th birthday, her abilities continued to develop in ways that amazed and sometimes concerned the adults around her. She could predict when animals were in distress, often leading rescue efforts to creatures that would have died without intervention. Her presence had a calming effect on even the most aggressive or frightened animals, and veterinarians throughout the region began consulting with her on difficult cases. The scientific community struggled to explain Lily's abilities within the framework of conventional understanding. Dr. Rodriguez published several papers about the case, proposing theories about genetic memory and interspecies communication that challenged established paradigms in animal behavior research. While her work was controversial, it opened new avenues of investigation that would influence the field for years to come. The story of the miracle at Mountain View Hospital became part of the curriculum at veterinary schools throughout the region, used as a case study in the importance of keeping an open mind about the possibilities of animal-human communication. While skeptics dismissed it as elaborate folklore, the documentation was too thorough, and the witnesses too credible to ignore entirely. As the years passed and Lily grew into adolescence, her connection to the natural world only deepened. She spent her free time in the forests and mountains surrounding her home, often returning with stories of encounters that seemed to belong more to fairy tales than to the modern world. But those who knew her understood that these experiences were as real and meaningful to her as any other aspect of her life. The Bear family continued to thrive in their mountain home, and occasionally one or both of the cubs would be spotted near the hospital grounds, as if checking on the place where they had been born and the human family that had welcomed them into the world. These sightings became treasured moments for the hospital's staff, reminders of the extraordinary events that had touched all their lives. Jessica watched her daughter's development with a mixture of pride and protective concern, understanding that Lily's gifts came with responsibilities that would shape the course of her entire life. The family legacy that had been revealed during those 3 days at the hospital was both a blessing and a burden, offering extraordinary opportunities for connection and healing, while also setting Lily apart from her peers in ways that could be isolating and difficult. Dr. Marshall retired from active practice but remained connected to the hospital as a consultant, his experience with the Bear family having given him insights into animal behavior and healing that proved valuable in training new veterinarians. He often spoke about the importance of remaining open to possibilities that couldn't be easily explained, encouraging young doctors to trust their instincts and pay attention to the subtle communications that passed between humans and animals. The break room, where Lily had maintained her vigil, became an informal shrine to the miracle that had occurred there. Hospital staff would sometimes pause at the window during difficult shifts, drawing comfort from the memory of those 3 extraordinary days when the boundaries between human and animal, between possible and impossible, had dissolved in the presence of a little girl's pure love and acceptance. As Lily entered her teenage years, she began to understand more fully the significance of her connection to the Bear family and the responsibilities that came with her inherited gifts. She started working with local wildlife rehabilitation centers, her abilities proving invaluable in the care and treatment of injured and orphaned animals. Her presence could calm the most traumatized creatures, and her intuitive understanding of their needs often meant the difference between life and death. The original bear cubs, now fully grown, had established territories of their own in the mountains surrounding the hospital. Wildlife researchers studying the local bear population noted unusual behaviors in these animals, including a remarkable lack of aggression toward humans and a tendency to seek out contact with people in distress. The bears seemed to have inherited their mother's understanding of the special relationship between their family and the humans who had welcomed them into the world. On quiet evenings, when the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, staff members would sometimes gather at the break room window to share stories about the miracle they had witnessed. New employees would listen with varying degrees of skepticism until they saw the documentation, the photographs, and the video recordings that preserved those extraordinary 3 days for posterity. The story became part of the cultural fabric of the mountain community, told and retold at family gatherings, school presentations, and community events. Each telling added new details and interpretations, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A 2-year-old girl and a family of bears had formed a connection that transcended the boundaries between species, creating a moment of pure communication and understanding that had touched everyone who witnessed it. As Lily prepared to graduate from high school, she began making plans to study veterinary medicine and wildlife biology, her path in life having been shaped by those 3 extraordinary days when she was just 2 years old. Her applications to college included essays about her experiences with the bear family, writings that moved admissions committees to tears, and opened doors to opportunities that would allow her to develop her gifts in service to both human and animal communities. The bear family, now scattered across the mountain range as the cubs established their own territories and families, continued to maintain some connection to the hospital grounds. Each spring, around the anniversary of the cubs' birth, at least one member of the original family would be spotted near the hospital, as if paying respects to the place where their extraordinary story had begun. Dr. Marshall, now in his 70s, continued to visit the hospital regularly, his white hair and gentle manner making him a beloved figure among staff and patients alike. He would often tell the story of the miracle to new employees, his eyes still lighting up with wonder as he described those 3 days that had changed his understanding of the connections between all living things. Jessica, now working as the head nurse in the pediatric ward, had become something of a local celebrity because of her daughter's remarkable story. But she wore her fame lightly, more interested in using the attention to promote understanding and respect for wildlife than in seeking personal recognition. She had established a foundation dedicated to wildlife rehabilitation and education, using the story of Lily and the bears to teach children about the importance of coexistence with the natural world. The hospital itself had embraced its role in the extraordinary story, incorporating wildlife-friendly practices into its operations and establishing partnerships with local conservation organizations. The grounds around the hospital had been designated as a wildlife sanctuary, ensuring that future generations of animals would find safe haven in the place where one family of bears had found unexpected friendship and assistance. As Lily's 18th birthday approached, marking 15 years since the miracle at Mountain View Hospital, the community began planning a celebration that would honor not just her coming of age, but the enduring legacy of those 3 extraordinary days. The event would bring together everyone who had been touched by the story, from the hospital staff who had witnessed it firsthand to the researchers who had studied its implications for understanding animal-human communication. The celebration took place on a perfect spring evening, with the mountains surrounding the hospital painted in the golden light of sunset. Lily, now a young woman with her mother's gentle strength and her own unique gifts, stood at the same break room window where she had maintained her vigil as a toddler. The clearing where the bear family had made their temporary home was empty now, but the memory of their presence filled the space with warmth and wonder. As the evening progressed and stories were shared about the impact of the miracle on everyone's lives, a hush fell over the gathering. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, 3 dark shapes had emerged from the shadows. The original bear family, now showing the gray of middle age, had returned to the place where their story had begun. The mother bear, still magnificent despite her years, led her now adult cubs to the center of the clearing where they had been born. The 3 bears sat in a circle, facing the hospital building, and began the same haunting vocalization that had marked their farewell 15 years earlier. But this time, the song was different, richer and more complex, as if they were sharing the stories of all the years that had passed since their first meeting with the little girl who had changed their lives. Lily, tears streaming down her face, pressed her hands against the window one more time and began to sing along with her old friends. Her voice, now mature and strong, wove through the Bears' song with the same natural harmony that had marked their first duet. The sound carried across the valley, touching the hearts of everyone who heard it and reminding them of the invisible threads that connect all living things. The song continued for several minutes, a celebration of friendship, growth, and the enduring power of love to bridge any divide. When it finally faded, the Bear family stood and walked slowly back toward the forest, but not before the mother bear turned one last time to raise her paw in the same gesture of farewell that had marked their first parting. As the bears disappeared into the shadows of the forest, Lily turned to face the gathered crowd of friends, family, and colleagues who had shared in this extraordinary moment. Her eyes, bright with tears and wonder, held the same wisdom that had marked her as special from the very beginning. She understood now, more fully than ever before, the responsibility that came with her gifts and the role she was destined to play in maintaining the delicate balance between human, civilization, and the natural world. The evening ended with quiet conversations and gentle farewells, but the impact of what everyone had witnessed would endure for the rest of their lives. The miracle at Mountain View Hospital had come full circle, from the desperate crying of a bear in labor to the joyful celebration of connections that transcend species and time. As the years that followed would prove, the story of Lily and the Bear family was far from over. It was, instead, the beginning of a lifetime dedicated to healing, understanding, and building bridges between the human and animal worlds. The little girl who had fearlessly approached a wild bear in distress had grown into a young woman ready to carry forward the legacy of love and connection that had been entrusted to her family for generations. The hospital returned to its normal routine, but it was forever changed by the miracle it had witnessed. The break room window became a place of pilgrimage for staff members seeking comfort during difficult times, and the story of those 3 extraordinary days continued to inspire new generations of medical professionals to approach their work with open hearts and minds. And somewhere in the mountains surrounding Mountain View Hospital, a family of bears continued to thrive, carrying within their genetic memory the story of a little girl who had shown them that love knows no boundaries, that connection transcends species, and that miracles are possible when hearts are open to the wonder that surrounds us every day. The legacy of those 3 days would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives for generations to come. It served as a reminder that in a world often divided by differences and misunderstanding, there are still moments when the barriers fall away, and we remember that we are all part of one great, interconnected web of life, each thread precious and necessary to the whole.